HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Furious Sky, The 500-Year History of America's Hurricanes, by Eric J. Dolin. Read by Bob Souer. Extracts. Supplied by a sub-librarian, with a nod to Herman Melville, whose classic Moby Dick and, in particular, its prefatory materials with the same title gave me this idea. Out of the south cometh the whirlwind. Job chapter 37, verse 9. Good God, what horror and destruction! It seemed as if a total dissolution of nature was taking place. The roaring of the sea and wind, fiery meteors flying about it in the air, the prodigious glare of almost perpetual lightning, the crash of the falling houses, and the ear-piercing shrieks of the distressed were sufficient to strike astonishment into angels. A teenage Alexander Hamilton, writing to his father describing a hurricane that barreled into his home island of St. Croix in late August 1772. Reader, persons who have never witnessed a hurricane, such as not infrequently desolates the sultry climates of the South, can scarcely form an idea of their terrific grandeur. Like a scythe of the destroying angel, it cuts everything by the roots. When at last its frightful blasts have ceased, nature, weeping and disconsolate, is left bereaved of her beautiful offspring. John James Audubon, 1834. There is probably no feature of nature more interesting to study than a hurricane, though feelings of the observer may sometimes be diverted by thoughts of personal safety. F. H. Bigelow, 1898. Remember to get the weather in your goddamned book. Weather is very important. Ernest Hemingway to John Dos Passos, 1932. All the thousands of hurricane stories boil down to this, that even with all modern scientific developments, a man and his family can be alone in a hurricane, as cut off by extreme peril from any human help as the first naked Indians who ever died in one. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, 1958. Introduction. The crawfish knew it was coming. On Wednesday, June 26, 1957, battalions of the crustaceans left their watery abodes along the southwestern coast of Louisiana and headed farther inland across streets and highways to escape the approaching storm. The locals knew it was coming too. Throughout the day, television and radio broadcasters, relying on the federal weather forecasts for guidance, warned area residents that Hurricane Audrey was on the way and advised those in low-lying areas to evacuate to higher ground. But since the warnings also said the hurricane wouldn't arrive until late Thursday afternoon, nobody evacuated right away, instead delaying their departure until the last possible moment. Around midnight on Wednesday, however, with the hurricane only about 170 miles from the coast, the situation changed dramatically. Strengthened by the warm Gulf of Mexico waters, Audrey transformed into a much stronger storm overnight and started speeding toward the Louisiana shore. Most people were asleep when the new and much more alarming forecast was issued at 1 a.m., and they had no idea the hurricane was almost upon them. Audrey zeroed in on Cameron Parish, Louisiana, near the mouth of the Sabine River where Texas and Louisiana meet. 80% of the rural parish consists of coastal marshes, while the remaining dry land averages only 4 feet above sea level. In the wee hours of Thursday, the outer edge of the hurricane roared in. As the whipping winds shook their houses and the boiling Gulf waters began rushing over the countryside, most of the roughly 6,000 parish residents, rudely jolted from their slumber, experienced the same reaction of stunned surprise. How could the hurricane be here already, they asked one another. The warning said it wasn't supposed to arrive until much later in the day. Their surprise was quickly replaced with an entirely different emotion, fear. And with fear came a determination to survive. Unfortunately, many would not. Early that morning, Dr. Cecil Clark and his wife Sybil were sitting on the couch in their 4-bedroom brick ranch house about 5 miles to the east of Cameron, the parish seat. The gusting winds and rain made it difficult to sleep, and they were already up when the phone rang. It was one of Dr. Clark's nurses calling from his 12-bed clinic in Cameron. The strain registered in her voice as she told him, "Water is seeping into the hospital from under the doors." Cecil and Sybil, who was a nurse and served as manager of the clinic, decided to drive there immediately to help take care of their 6 patients. They roused their housekeeper, Zulme Dubois, and asked her to watch over their 3 youngest children. The Clarks' 2 older boys, 8-year-old John and 7-year-old Joe, were at their grandparents' house 15 miles away. The Clarks' car ground to a halt just 3 blocks from the clinic. The water was too high to proceed, so they turned around and raced back home. Still anxious about their patients, the Clarks decided to split up. Cecil would head back to the clinic while Sybil would stay behind and get the kids ready to evacuate once Cecil returned. Cecil enlisted the help of his neighbor, James Durand, who had a truck. Cecil's plan was to follow the truck for as long as he could and then, when the water got too deep, abandon his car and ride in the truck the rest of the way. If the car ended up near the clinic, Cecil thought he could use it to rush home before the hurricane struck full force. In the meantime, he hoped that he and his nurses would be able to transport his patients to the Cameron Courthouse, the largest and sturdiest building in the parish. Sybil watched her husband and James drive off, and then she and Zulme woke the kids and got them dressed. The doctor's plan failed. Fast-rising waters forced the truck to turn around, and Cecil and James headed back home. But surging waters hurled Cecil's car off the road into a ditch. James, unaware that his neighbor was no longer following him, continued driving. Cecil jumped into the raging, waist-deep waters and sought shelter with a family in a nearby house. As dawn was breaking, everyone in the house climbed to the attic, where they huddled together for warmth. Occasionally, Cecil peered out into the lightning gloom only to see nearby houses crumble under the assault of 145-mile-per-hour winds and a 12-foot storm surge, upon which 10 to 15-foot waves tumbled and crashed. Storm surge is the abnormal rise in seawater level during a storm, measured as the height of the water above the normal predicted astronomical tide. A couple of hours later, the hurricane made landfall just a few miles to the west. Landfall is the point at which the center or eye of the hurricane intersects with the coastline. Around 5 p.m. on Thursday, when the winds finally subsided, Cecil and the others ventured outside. A scene of utter devastation greeted them. Homes obliterated, mighty trees washed away, and water receding toward the Gulf, covering the land in every direction. Slowly, storm refugees gathered around. This being a close-knit community, they all knew the doctor. They told him that many of the injured were being taken to Cameron's courthouse and pleaded with him to go there to provide medical treatment. Cecil was torn. In one direction was his family, hopefully alive and possibly in need of his help. In the other direction were his fellow citizens and his patients, whom he had taken an oath to serve. Placing his medical obligation over his personal concerns, as he knew Sybil would have done under the same circumstances, Cecil began the long walk to the courthouse. He arrived there at 7 p.m. While Cecil was coping with the storm, Sybil was enduring her own ordeal. "When I saw the water rising," Sybil later recalled, "I knew Cecil couldn't make it home, and I knew we were trapped." Since the attic was too small to crawl into, Sybil and Zulme retreated to the kitchen. They placed the children on the counter and barricaded the door with a chest of drawers, hoping to keep the wind and surging waters at bay. For hours the house was under siege, trembling in the maelstrom. As the water seeped under the door and crept ever higher, Sybil and Zulme joined the children atop the counter and clutched them tight, hoping to give them some sense of security. Around 8 a.m., the house collapsed, and Sybil was temporarily knocked out. When she came to, she frantically searched for her children and Zulme, but they were nowhere to be found. Carried along in the debris-laden water, Sybil was repeatedly submerged, only to claw her way back to the surface. Finally, she found refuge in a neighbor's house, climbing in through a hole in its roof. But that house, too, was soon demolished by the storm. Throughout the day and into the following morning, Sybil, bruised, battered, and chilled to the bone, drifted on a remnant of the roof. Finally, at noon on Friday, a small boat picked her up and took her to Lake Charles, a city about 30 miles from Cameron. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, Cecil ministered to the sick and injured, including his patients from the clinic who had been brought there Thursday morning. Whenever someone new entered the building, Cecil would ask whether they had heard anything about his family or Zulme. Each time he got the same soul-crushing response: no. Despite his mounting grief, Cecil continued his rounds, a steely commitment to his work keeping him from emotionally and physically breaking down. At 7 p.m. on Friday, Cameron Parish's state representative Alvin Dyson was in the courthouse radio room, speaking with the operator from Lake Charles, trying to get the latest information on recovery efforts. As soon as the operator told him that Sybil and the two oldest Clark boys, John and Joe, were alive and in Lake Charles, Alvin dropped the receiver and dashed through the building searching for Cecil. When he found the doctor and shared the news, Cecil didn't believe it. It must be a mistake. The two boys were with my mother. They must mean my mother and the two boys. Cecil asked Alvin to get the operator back on the line to confirm what he had heard. A few minutes later, Alvin reported that there was no mistake. Cecil's wife and two sons were alive, as were his parents. Soon, Cecil was on a helicopter heading for Lake Charles, where he was reunited with Sybil and the boys, who had ridden out the hurricane alongside their grandparents, tied together with rope to the crook of an old oak tree. The reunion, however, was heart-wrenchingly bittersweet, for although Sybil and the two eldest boys had survived, the three youngest Clark children and Zulme had perished. After spending some time with his family, Cecil dutifully answered reporters' questions about conditions in Cameron before going to sleep for the first time in nearly 3 days. Just a few hours later, he was up again, headed for the local air base to catch a helicopter ride back to Cameron to continue caring for those who needed his help. In the ensuing months, Cecil would be showered with local and national awards, honoring his selfless heroism in tending to the sick and injured in the aftermath of the hurricane. But all the adulation made him a bit uncomfortable. "I did what was necessary for me to do as a doctor," he said. "That's just the way it was." This harrowing and tragic story is just one of thousands that played out that day. Hurricane Audrey destroyed nearly every building in Cameron Parish, leaving 5,000 people homeless and causing $150 to $200 million in damage. Roughly 500 people died, the vast majority coming from the parish seat, Cameron, which lost more than a third of its population. In the immediate aftermath, area residents wandered about in a daze, shell-shocked by the experience. Some could be heard muttering to themselves, "Everything's gone." While Hurricane Audrey is unique in its particulars, from a broader perspective, it is an all-too-familiar narrative. Hurricanes have always been an integral, inevitable, and painful part of the American experience. Just as we can count on the sun rising and setting each day, so too can we expect hurricanes to periodically visit our shores. These days, their arrival is heralded by an annual ritual that is an ominous portent of potential danger on the horizon. In the spring, after the computer models have been run and scientists have scrutinized the numbers, government, academic, and private organizations issue their outlooks for the upcoming hurricane season, which officially runs from June 1st through November 30th. The news is trumpeted in the press and eagerly consumed by a weather-obsessed culture. These reports are just predictions, a range of possibilities that offer no guarantees of where, when, or whether a hurricane might crash ashore, but they incite anxiety. If you are among the many tens of millions of people inhabiting the East Coast, Gulf Coast, or the Caribbean, hurricanes are looming threats that might invade your life, and there is nothing you can do to prevent their strike. Although hurricanes do hit Hawaii, they are extremely rare there. Nevertheless, Hawaii's worst hurricane, Iniki, is discussed in Chapter 8. As for the West Coast, the only documented case of a hurricane striking that region was one in 1858 that plowed into San Diego. Hurricanes spare the West Coast for two reasons. The prevailing winds tend to push storms offshore, and the waters are generally too cold to sustain such massive storms. In an average year, 6 hurricanes dance over the Atlantic, 3 of which are major hurricanes defined as having sustained winds of at least 111 miles per hour. Winds are considered sustained when they maintain a measured or estimated average speed for 1 minute at a height of 30 feet above ground. The number of hurricanes varies from year to year. Fortunately, few of these storms actually make landfall. Typically, 2 hurricanes hit the United States annually, and a major one pummels us only about once every 2 years. There have also been years when not a single hurricane visited American shores, or those that did had minimal impact. During such relatively quiet times, memories fade and the fear of hurricanes begins to diminish. Former National Hurricane Center Director Max Mayfield called this dangerous tendency to forget the lessons of the past hurricane amnesia. Only the old-timers who have the hard-earned wisdom of age know what every meteorologist knows. If you live in a place that hurricanes have visited before, they will one day come again. Even if your slice of the coast has never been struck by a hurricane or has received only glancing blows, your time, too, will likely come. But hurricanes are not equal opportunity offenders. While 21 coastal states have been hit by hurricanes, certain states are particularly prone to be afflicted by these massive storms. Residents of Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Louisiana, and South Carolina, in that order, take the brunt of the punishment, with Florida alone accounting for roughly 40% of all hurricane strikes. Hurricanes, however, are not merely coastal events. After making landfall, they typically head inland. Although they eventually fade away, as they degrade and weaken, they can still leave a trail of calamity in their wake. And no matter where you reside in the United States, even if hurricanes or their remnants never reach you, they can still significantly impact your life in the form of economic dislocation, harm to friends and relatives, and the use of federal funds for relief instead of other public purposes. Hurricanes have been churning up ocean waters and slamming into land for all of recorded history, and almost certainly much farther back into the recesses of time. Every society tormented by hurricanes bears the scars of these encounters, including the native populations of the Americas, the European settlers who came after them, and the American colonists as well as the nation they created. Coursing through the centuries like brawlers, bobbing and weaving and slugging anyone or anything that stands in their way, hurricanes have left an indelible mark on American history. Since 1980, they have accounted for roughly 50% of the cost of all the natural disasters in the United States that exceeded $1 billion in damage. And going back to the late 1800s, hurricanes have killed nearly 30,000 people. Of course, hurricanes will continue to make history, and there are strong indications that the blows they land will only become more powerful and more destructive in the future. A Furious Sky is the history of the American hurricane, or, more specifically, the hurricanes that have hit what is today the United States. Given that there have been hundreds, if not more than 1,000 such hurricanes in the past 5 centuries, A Furious Sky must understandably be selective, focusing mainly on storms that have arguably had the most impact on the nation's long history. Before the discussion goes any further, however, a key term must be defined. What is a hurricane? This is a surprisingly complex question, but by way of introduction, a basic definition will do. Simply put, hurricanes are violent, swirling storms with sustained winds of at least 74 miles per hour. They generally form where the ocean's upper layer, down to about 150 feet, reaches the trigger temperature of at least 80 degrees Fahrenheit, thereby providing the massive amounts of heat energy needed to fuel them. 2 other conditions necessary for a hurricane to thrive are low vertical wind shear, which keeps the hurricane from being ripped apart, and an abundance of warm, moist air that evaporates from the ocean surface. Vertical wind shear is a change of wind speed or direction with a change in altitude. When that moist air rises, it cools and condenses, forming clouds and releasing the heat that powers the storm. Hurricanes can be anywhere from tens of miles in diameter to more than 1,000 and over 50,000 feet high, reaching from the ocean surface all the way up to the top of the troposphere. These behemoths rotate in a counterclockwise direction in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern. But wherever and however they spin, hurricanes are characterized by extremely low pressure and a relatively calm center called the eye, with the most ferocious winds occurring in the eye wall and decreasing in intensity as one travels outward from the core. Hurricanes whip up the seas, generate gargantuan waves and mammoth storm surges, and pour down such diluvial quantities of water that they seem to presage the end of time. Hurricanes also discharge vast quantities of energy, Considering only the wind, an average hurricane produces the equivalent of half of the world's electrical generating capacity. But hurricanes produce even more energy when water vapor condenses to form clouds, a type of energy known as the latent heat of condensation. By this measure, an average hurricane produces the equivalent of 200 times the world's generating capacity. To put it another way, an ordinary hurricane releases the same amount of energy as 10,000 nuclear bombs. For a major hurricane, the number is higher still. Of all the hurricane's astounding features, the most curious and startling is the eye, which is typically 20 to 40 miles wide. While the hurricane rages all around it, creating the meteorological equivalent of a temper tantrum on steroids, the eye is comparatively tranquil. Here the winds fall away to gentle warm breezes and the skies open up to let in the sun's streaming rays or the ethereal glow of stars and planets. In some eyes the core is virtually clear, but even when swirling clouds remain, there is a serene aspect to the sky. And as the spiraling clouds of the eye wall ascend, they tilt back, forming a massive and undeniably grand amphitheater miles high. The eye is experienced quite differently depending on whether one is on land or at sea. On the ocean, despite the dying of the winds and transformation of the sky, the power of the hurricane is still evident in the waves and swells that race in all different directions, smashing into one another, generating a jumbled landscape where mountains of water merge and diverge, and rise and fall in an erratic way. One mariner in the 1860s, whose ship spent 30 minutes in the eye of a hurricane off the coast of New York, described the sea as a number of huge watery cones that were dancing an infernal reel played by some necromancer. But on land, as the eye passes overhead, it is as if the hurricane has departed. In fact, there are more than a few examples when people thought this was the case and walked about in the eye, confident the worst was over, only to be caught in the open when the eye moved on, leaving them to confront the fury of the storm's other side. Most of the hurricanes in the North Atlantic originate not over the water, as some may think, but over the southern flanks of the Sahara Desert. There, a convergence of arid, scorching desert air and the moist air winging in off the Indian Ocean from the east and coming from the Gulf of Guinea coast to the south creates areas of low pressure. These low-pressure pockets are accompanied by intense thunderstorms that extend into the upper atmosphere and are steered to the west by the prevailing easterly winds. This mass of unstable air, called an African easterly wave, leaves the continent roughly every 3 to 4 days and is swept out over the Atlantic. Fortunately, these systems usually fizzle out or fall apart, but every 4th or 5th wave continues its westward journey, wafting past the Cape Verde Islands where trouble can brew. Under the favorable conditions mentioned earlier, these waves can strengthen into a tropical depression, a system with organized circulation but sustained winds of 38 miles per hour or less. If such conditions persist, these depressions can grow into tropical storms, with sustained winds ranging from 39 miles per hour to as high as 73 miles per hour. Only a fraction of African easterly waves, however, ever ascend the weather ladder, evolving from tropical depression to tropical storm to a full-fledged hurricane that travels across the Atlantic. Since these hurricanes begin to take shape in the vicinity of the Cape Verde Islands, they are often called Cape Verde hurricanes. While about 60% of the hurricanes in the North Atlantic are Cape Verde hurricanes, they account for roughly 85% of all major hurricanes. Many other hurricanes, which require the same favorable environment to thrive, are born in the Caribbean Sea or the Gulf of Mexico as tropical depressions, and rather than barreling across the Atlantic from east to west, they often travel roughly from south to north. In addition, a significant number of hurricanes form in the mid or western Atlantic. Whether they come from the east across the Atlantic or arise in the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico and come up from the south, hurricanes typically travel over the ocean at a rather leisurely pace of between 10 and 25 miles per hour. However, a few are veritable speed demons that have reached speeds as high as 60 miles per hour. Exactly when and where a hurricane will make landfall can remain a mystery up until it is about to roar ashore. Even with the most sophisticated technology tracking their whereabouts and forecasting their course, these storms are somewhat unpredictable. Hurricanes share many characteristics, including powerful winds, torrential rain, plummeting pressure, and the magisterial eye. They often follow similar paths, are of similar size, and cause similar damage. Nevertheless, no two hurricanes are identical. Each one has its distinctive meteorological history written in the sky and on the land. Hurricanes go by different names in different parts of the world. For example, they are cyclones in the Indian Ocean, and in the northwestern Pacific Ocean they are called typhoons, a term derived from the Chinese taifun, meaning a great or big wind. Some Australians refer to hurricanes as cockeyed bobs or willy-willies. In the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the Gulf of Mexico, the regions that are the main focus of this book, hurricanes are called just that, hurricanes, a word that has its origins in the languages of the Caribbean basin, where native cultures attributed the region's wild weather to the work of gods. The Mayans named their god of storms or destruction Hunraken, and the Quiche and the Arawak called theirs Huracan, while the Taino peoples called theirs Huracan. Over the centuries of European colonization, one or more of these names ultimately morphed into Huracan, Uragan, Orkan, Orkanen, and hurricane in Spanish, French, Dutch, Danish, and English, respectively. Hurricane is not a monolithic designation. There are gradations within the umbrella term. According to the Saffir-Simpson Hurricane Wind Scale, there are 5 categories of hurricanes ranked from 1 to 5. The higher the number, the more intense the hurricane. Winds in Category 1 hurricanes range from 74 to 95 miles per hour. In Category 2, from 96 to 110 miles per hour. In Category 3, from 111 to 129 miles per hour. In Category 4, from 130 to 156 miles per hour. And for the ultimate Category 5 hurricanes, winds equal or exceed 157 miles per hour. Category 3 and higher hurricanes are classified as major hurricanes, the ones that are typically the most damaging and feared, even though less powerful hurricanes can also cause tremendous harm. While a Category 1 hurricane can rip shingles and vinyl siding off a building, topple small trees, and down power lines, a Category 5 storm will result in catastrophic damage, leaving impacted areas virtually uninhabitable for days or even months, and in some cases creating such apocalyptic conditions that people choose to relocate rather than rebuild. As one climbs the hurricane category hierarchy, the force of the winds does not increase in a linear fashion. Instead, it jumps. For example, a relatively anemic Category 1 hurricane with winds of a mere 74 miles per hour could launch a 2x4 into the air with such force that it is capable of being driven clear through a thin, non-reinforced concrete block. Doubling the wind speed to 148 miles per hour, a strong Category 4, does not double the force but rather quadruples it, making the storm 4 times as powerful as a Category 1. At that wind speed, a flying 2x4 would likely go through almost anything it hit. The Saffir-Simpson scale came into being only at the tail end of the 20th century. Before that, back to the early 1800s, hurricanes were typically defined by the Beaufort scale as force 12 storms, having winds so strong that no canvas could withstand them. Much later, when speed was added to the Beaufort scale, force 12 storms were defined as those having sustained winds higher than 74 miles per hour. Going back further in time, when humans' ability to accurately measure wind speed was meager or non-existent, the hurricane label was applied subjectively to storms of immense violence that were deemed to be worthy of such a designation. Thus, in this book, hurricanes will be identified by their Saffir-Simpson category when data allows, but will be called only hurricanes when it does not. The Hurricane Research Division of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, has analyzed the historical records and, for hurricanes dating back to 1851, has assigned each one a Saffir-Simpson category level based on the available information such as pressure and wind speed. Those are the category designations used in this book. While the Saffir-Simpson and Beaufort scales both focus on wind speed, water poses a far greater threat to human life. The massive storm surges and torrential rains that accompany hurricanes are the real killers. Together, these two elemental forces account for roughly 9 out of every 10 direct hurricane-related fatalities.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?